We are at the very end of 2024 and it has been a challenge to be a gardener this year, to say the least. So today we'll go over a recap, what those challenges were, what my biggest highlights were in the garden, and of course I'm going to reveal how much harvest I have yielded this year. So let's go. Welcome back to the garden. If you're new here, my name is Jair and this is my second year in the garden in the Netherlands in Zone 8. And like I said, it has been a challenging year, both for beginning gardeners, props if you're sticking around for 2025, but I've also heard a lot of seasoned veterans of the garden complain about this year. So we'll get into that in a bit. But before we touch on that, I'm going to quickly recap what I've been doing since the beginning of the year. If you have been following me since last year, then you know that my garden has been picked on by the voles. And if you don't know what voles are, they are these pretty big rodents that tunnel underneath your garden and underneath your crops, eventually going upwards, grabbing the crop, nibbling on them. And then all your hard work goes to a cute little rodent that has also been the bane of my existence last year. So to combat the vole, I have been lifting up all of my grow beds in the beginning of this year, and I put some hardware cloth underneath them so that the vole couldn't get into them. Not only that, but I've added a lot of grow beds this year, and I've also, of course, added the hardware cloth underneath them. And it worked out fine, as the vole has not been bothering me or my crops anymore this year. So that was really the solution to my problem. However, this year has been a challenge for other reasons. One of them being the climate and temperature. It has been cold and wet throughout both the winter and the spring of this year up until June. I think the highest temperature that we got before June was around 15 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold because sometimes we get 20 degrees Celsius at the end of March or even in April. So that has been a big difference, which also meant that the grow season had been delayed for at least a month to even 6 weeks. That, in combination with the pretty mild winter that we had previous year, meant one thing and one thing only: slugs and snails everywhere. It was horrible. If you had started a garden this year, then I can't imagine that you will never want to try gardening again, because the slugs and snails were eating up everything. I think everybody in Europe has experienced this, even the veterans in the garden, like I said. And it has been pretty tough. All the seedlings, they had such a slim chance of surviving, because as soon as you put them in the ground, that very same evening, they would be mowed down by all the slugs and the snails. So yeah, pretty terrible and a pretty rough start to the year. Now, that tough start of the year has taught me a few things, mostly determination and grit, but it also has taught me to grow my seedlings indoors a little bit bigger before planting them into the garden, so that they would have a better chance of surviving the onslaught of the slugs and the snails. So I think it is safe to say that the delayed season in combination with the slugs and the snails has been the biggest challenge this year by far. One thing I wanted to mention is that this was my very first year that I grew potatoes. Now, I've heard a lot of people complain about growing potatoes this year because it was such a wet year. However, I have not experienced any problems, and I think that is mostly due to the fact that I have been growing them in raised garden beds. So that meant that any excess rain could just easily drain away into the soil, and none of my potatoes would be waterlogged. So I definitely think that is one of the biggest pros of growing in raised garden beds, and I'm very happy that I took the time to put a lot of raised garden beds in my garden. And now onto the biggest highlight of this year, and that easily has to be the grow dome, the geodesic greenhouse that I put into my garden. And I am so glad that it's here, because I was kind of dreading this entire project because I wasn't really sure if I was going to pull it off. But I did, we did. It brought my family together for a few days to set up the base structure and cover it. But the entire project probably took a few weeks to a few months to get it to the stage where it is right now. It is fully functional, but I want to keep adding things to it, but that will be something for next year. So this was easily the biggest money sink of last year and the biggest project of this year. And like I said, I am so glad that it is here. It provides cover and warmth for my plants. It provides cover for me if it starts raining really hard. But of course, mostly it will extend the growing season so that I can start earlier in the year, but also continue longer on in the season. And I might even be able to grow throughout the winter, maybe even this winter. So we'll see. Now, before we get into the final score of this year's harvest, an honorable mention has to go to the Johnson Soup bioreactor, and specifically the compost that it has been generating and yielded me this year. Because recently I have topped off all of my grow beds with fresh new fungal-rich compost, which will not only massively improve the quality of my soil, but it will also save me a lot of money. So definitely an honorable mention there. Right then, the moment we have all been waiting for, the cost versus the yield. And I've grabbed my cell phone to help me memorize a few numbers. Last year, the costs were 765 euros, while the yield was 415 euros. And that was good for about 95 kilograms of harvest. This year's costs were significantly lower, 356 euros. However, the yield denoted in euros was only 295 euros. Wait, what? Yes, you've heard me correctly. The yield denoted in euros was less than last year. However, the amount of harvest I got in kilograms was 92. Now, this whole situation is because of a few reasons. First of all, like I said, the entire season was delayed because of the bad weather, and any seedlings that we tried to put into the ground were gobbled up by slugs and snails. So that meant that a lot of the early crops, such as lettuce and spinach, were simply not there. Not only that, but last year I had a surprise flush of oyster mushrooms because I was using spent mushroom compost, and I didn't use that last year. Now, oyster mushrooms don't really weigh a lot in kilograms, but they are pretty expensive, at least here in the Netherlands. I also had a lot less pumpkins this year compared to last year. I almost had no cucumbers, and I had very little corn. And that makes up the biggest difference in euros last year compared to this year. That being said, like I've mentioned, the total harvest in kilograms last year was 95 kilograms, while this year it was 92 kilograms. And that is because, for example, potatoes are pretty heavy, but they are not really expensive in the store. Not only that, but the total return on investment this year was about 80%, while last year it was around 52%, I believe. So even though in euros I have yielded less, in kilograms I have yielded about the same, and it cost me less. Not only that, but I haven't taken into account the amount of compost that I have produced myself. And by that I mean that I did take into account how much money it cost me to buy some new compost this year, but it was very difficult for me to determine how much I had saved by producing my own compost. So the equation is not 100% balanced. So last year, the biggest money sink was definitely the dome that I am standing in right now, while this year the higher costs were, for example, the paint and the varnish that I bought for the dome, as well as the hardware cloth that I used underneath my grow beds. That stuff is really expensive here in the Netherlands. Now, before I wrap up this video and this successful garden year, I want to give out a very, very big thankful to you guys, because my small YouTube channel has grown over 1,200 subscribers this year, and I'm extremely grateful for all of the support. And if you want to support me and you haven't subscribed yet, then please do so. I wish you a very happy ending to this year and a very healthy 2025. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.